This is a story titled The Mystery of the Old Well. Thank you for listening, and enjoy the tale. Chapter 1. The Unearthed Secret. The morning sun filtered through the canopy of ancient oaks, casting dappled shadows over what had once been a grand estate. St. Mary Mead lay quiet that day, its residents blissfully unaware of the storm about to break upon their tranquil village. It was in such moments when life seemed as still as the surface of a pond that Miss Marple often reminded herself how deceptive appearances could be. Mr. Jonathan Hargreaves, newly arrived from London and full of modern ideas, had purchased Willowmere Manor with grand plans for renovation. A tall, wiry man in his late 30s, he carried himself with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. His decision to restore the crumbling estate had sparked both curiosity and gossip among the villagers. Some admired his ambition, others whispered behind closed doors, speculating about his true motives. But no one could deny the transformation already underway at Willowmere. Scaffolding now clung to the weathered stone walls like ivy, and workmen tramped across the grounds, their boots leaving muddy tracks in the dewy grass. It was on this particular morning, while overseeing the clearing of an overgrown section of the garden, that Mr. Hargreaves made a discovery that would shatter the peaceful monotony of St. Mary Mead. The workers, armed with pickaxes and shovels, had been tasked with removing a cluster of brambles that had long concealed a disused corner of the property. As they hacked away at the stubborn roots, the earth gave way unexpectedly, revealing something far older and far darker than anyone had anticipated. "Sir," called out one of the laborers, his voice trembling slightly. "You'd best come see this." Jonathan hurried over, brushing aside stray leaves and dirt with his gloved hands. Beneath the tangled vegetation lay the circular rim of a well, its stones moss-covered and cracked with age. At first glance, it appeared unremarkable, a relic of another time, perhaps used by the original occupants of the manor. But then came the second discovery. There's something down there," stammered the worker, pointing into the depths of the shaft. He held up a lantern, its flickering light barely penetrating the darkness below. The beam illuminated something pale and skeletal resting at the bottom, an arm, or what remained of it, jutting out from beneath a pile of rubble. Miss Marple happened to be passing by later that afternoon when she noticed the commotion near Willowmere. She paused under the pretense of admiring Mrs. Price Ridley's roses, but couldn't help overhearing snippets of conversation between two women who stood nearby, clutching their shopping baskets tightly. "They say it's been there for decades," murmured one, her face pale beneath her wide-brimmed hat. "Decades, mind you. Just sitting there all these years, waiting to be found." "Waiting?" echoed the other, her voice tinged with unease. "Or hiding?" Intrigued, Miss Marple turned her attention back to the scene unfolding before her. Constable Palkins had arrived by now, along with Dr. Haydock, whose medical bag swung heavily at his side. The constable looked distinctly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other as he conferred with Jonathan Hargreaves. Meanwhile, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by morbid fascination and the irresistible pull of mystery. Miss Marple sighed softly to herself. Human nature, she thought, never changed. People were always eager to witness tragedy, even if they claimed otherwise. And yet, she knew better than most that every tragedy bore within it the seeds of truth hidden beneath layers of deceit and misdirection. As she watched, her sharp eyes caught sight of someone lingering at the edge of the crowd. Emily Trefusis, the vicar's daughter, whose nervous glances toward the well betrayed more than mere curiosity. Emily had always struck Miss Marple as a sensitive soul, prone to reading too much into things, or perhaps just enough. Later that evening, as twilight settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat in her cozy parlor, knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she pondered the day's events. She recalled a similar case many years ago, though the details eluded her for the moment. Something about a well, or perhaps a pit. Her thoughts drifted back to the faces she had seen earlier, the anxious expressions, the furtive looks exchanged between neighbors. There was something lurking beneath the surface here, something buried deeper than bones. And so, as the clock ticked steadily toward midnight, Miss Marple resolved to pay closer attention to the goings-on at Willowmere Manor. For in her experience, old wells rarely held only water, and secrets, like bodies, seldom stayed buried forever. Chapter 2. Whispers Beneath the Surface. The following morning dawned grey and overcast, as though the heavens themselves mourned the secrets unearthed at Willowmere Manor. Miss Marple rose early, her mind still lingering on the events of the previous day. She had spent a restless night piecing together fragments of memory, shadows of stories long past that seemed to echo faintly in the present. By the time she sat down to breakfast, she felt certain of one thing: this discovery was no mere accident. As she buttered her toast, her thoughts turned to Jonathan Hargreaves. There was something about him, a restless energy, an almost feverish determination that set her instincts tingling. He wasn't like the other newcomers who occasionally drifted into St. Mary Mead, seeking refuge from city life or hoping to reinvent themselves in the quiet countryside. No, Jonathan carried with him an air of purpose, as if he was searching for something specific within the crumbling walls of Willowmere. But what? Her musings were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Price Ridley, who swept into the vicarage garden without so much as a knock. The formidable woman was dressed in her usual severe black attire, her sharp features softened only slightly by the wide-brimmed hat perched atop her head. "Miss Marple," she exclaimed, clutching her handbag tightly. "Have you heard the latest? They've brought up the remains. Dr. Haydock says it's been there for decades, at least 50 years, perhaps more." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, but maintained her calm demeanor. "Indeed," she replied, pouring another cup of tea. "Such discoveries always stir up quite a bit of interest, don't they, Mrs. Price?" Ridley leaned forward conspiratorially. "And you'll never guess what else they found: a locket around the neck of the poor soul, whoever they may have been. Apparently, it's engraved with initials. Can you imagine? A keepsake buried alongside the body. It's also dreadfully romantic and sinister." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Initials, she mused, often held far more significance than people realized. A name could be a key, unlocking doors to forgotten histories and hidden motives. She made a mental note to inquire further about the mysterious AM. Later, after Mrs. Price Ridley departed, leaving behind a trail of gossip and speculation, Miss Marple decided it was time to pay a visit to Dr. Haydock. The good doctor, though sometimes exasperated by her probing questions, valued her keen insight and often welcomed her perspective on matters both medical and criminal. She found him in his surgery, poring over notes with a furrowed brow. Upon seeing her, he smiled wearily. "Ah, Miss Marple, I should have known you'd come calling sooner or later. Sit down, won't you?" Miss Marple settled into the chair opposite him, her knitting needles already clicking softly in her lap. "You know me too well, Doctor," she said with a twinkle in her eye. "I simply couldn't resist asking about the unfortunate discovery at Willowmere." Dr. Haydock sighed, removing his spectacles and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "It's as grim as you might expect. Based on preliminary examination, the remains are those of a young woman, likely in her 20s. Cause of death appears to be blunt force trauma to the skull. Beyond that, I'll need to conduct further tests, but..." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Let's just say, based on the condition of the bones, I doubt this was a natural demise." Miss Marple nodded sagely. "And the locket?" He reached into his desk drawer and produced a small evidence bag containing the delicate gold pendant. Through the plastic, She could see the intricate filigree design and the faint etching of two letters, *AM*. The chain was tarnished with age, yet the craftsmanship spoke of quality, a trinket meant to endure. "Do you recognize the initials, Doctor?" Haydock asked, watching her closely. Miss Marple studied the locket for a moment before shaking her head. "Not immediately. But initials can mean many things, especially when taken out of context. Perhaps AM refers to a person, or perhaps it stands for something else entirely. We mustn't jump to conclusions, Doctor." Haydock chuckled. "Leave it to you to keep us grounded. Still, I suspect this will shake up our little village considerably. Secrets have a way of resurfacing at the most inconvenient times." On her way home, Miss Marple stopped by the post office to collect her mail. As she waited in line, she overheard snippets of conversation among the villagers. Speculation ran rampant. Some believed the remains belonged to a servant girl who had vanished mysteriously during the war. Others whispered of a love triangle gone tragically wrong. Amidst the chatter, one voice stood out: Emily Trefusis, speaking quietly to her friend Clara Benson. "I'm telling you, Clara, it has to be connected to the old rumors about Willowmere," Emily said, glancing nervously around to ensure no one was listening. "Remember what Great-Aunt Edith used to say about the manor being cursed?" Clara shushed her quickly, but not before Miss Marple caught the tail end of their exchange. Cursed, indeed, Miss Marple thought wryly. Folklore often served as a convenient mask for darker truths. Yet there was merit in exploring local legends. They frequently contained kernels of fact buried beneath layers of embellishment. That evening, as rain began to patter against her windows, Miss Marple sat by the fire, reviewing the day's findings. The initials *AM*, the locket, the whispers of curses, all pointed to a story waiting to be unraveled. And then there was Jonathan Hargreaves himself. Why had he chosen Willowmere, of all places? Was it truly coincidence that led him to uncover such a macabre secret? Her reverie was interrupted by a knock at the door. Opening it, she found none other than Constable Palkins, looking unusually grave. "Miss Marple," he began, removing his cap, "I hate to bother you, but Mr. Hargreaves has reported another strange occurrence. Someone broke into the manor last night. Nothing stolen, but several rooms were ransacked. It seems someone else is interested in whatever lies hidden at Willowmere." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet resolve. "How intriguing," she murmured. "It would appear, Constable, that we are not the only ones searching for answers." As the constable left, she returned to her chair, her mind racing. This mystery was growing more complex by the hour, its threads twisting and tangling like ivy around an ancient oak. But Miss Marple knew better than to rush headlong into the thicket. Patience, observation, and a keen understanding of human nature, these were the tools she wielded best. And so, as the storm outside intensified, casting flickering shadows across her cozy room, Miss Marple prepared herself for the journey ahead. For in St. Mary Mead, even the smallest ripple could reveal the deepest currents, and the truth, however elusive, always preferred to come to light in its own time. Chapter 3: Threads of the Past. The rain continued to fall throughout the night, turning the cobblestone streets of St. Mary Mead into a glistening mosaic by morning. Miss Marple woke early, her mind already racing ahead to the day's possibilities. She had always believed that every mystery carried within it echoes of the past, patterns repeated, mistakes revisited, secrets buried but never truly forgotten. And in this case, she sensed that the key to unraveling the enigma of Willowmere Manor lay not in the present, but in the shadows of history. After a leisurely breakfast, she decided to pay a visit to Mrs. Elspeth Treadwell, the village's unofficial historian and keeper of its collective memory. Mrs. Treadwell, now in her late 70s, had lived in St. Merrymead all her life, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of its inhabitants and their stories. Her cottage, nestled at the edge of the village, was a treasure trove of faded photographs, yellowed letters, and dusty ledgers, relics of a time long past. Miss Marple found her seated by the fireplace, knitting a scarf with surprising vigor despite her age. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old books, a comforting aroma that seemed to wrap itself around visitors like a warm embrace. "Ah, Miss Marple, Mrs. Treadwell greeted her with a smile. "I wondered when you'd come knocking. I've heard about the discovery at Willowmere. Dreadful business, isn't it?" "It certainly is," Miss Marple replied, taking the proffered seat across from her. "And I thought you might be able to shed some light on the matter. You see, I'm particularly interested in any stories or rumors surrounding the manor before it fell into disrepair." Mrs. Treadwell set her knitting aside and leaned back in her chair, her eyes clouding with reminiscence. "Willowmere has seen its share of scandal over the years. Once upon a time, it belonged to the Maitland family, a proud lineage, though not without its skeletons. They were well respected, of course, but there were whispers, always whispers." Miss Marple's ears perked up. "Whispers about what exactly?" "Well, for one, there was young Amelia Maitland, Amelia May, as everyone called her. Such a beauty she was, with hair like spun gold and a laugh that could charm the birds from the trees. But she vanished without a trace sometime in the summer of 1942. Some said she ran off with a soldier, others claimed foul play. No one ever found out for sure." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Amelia May A.M." she murmured under her breath. Could the initials on the locket belong to her? It seemed too coincidental to dismiss outright. Mrs. Treadwell nodded gravely. "Indeed. Poor girl. She was engaged to be married to Thomas Hargreaves, no less." "Yes, the very same family," she added, noting Miss Marple's raised eyebrow. "But their romance ended tragically. After Amelia disappeared, Thomas left St. Merrymead and never returned. The Maitlands sold the estate shortly thereafter, and it changed hands several times before falling into ruin." Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. The connection between the Maitlands and the Hargreaves intrigued her. Was Jonathan's arrival at Willowmere mere happenstance, or did he harbor some deeper purpose tied to his family's history? Did anyone suspect foul play in Amelia's disappearance? Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle yet probing. Mrs. Treadwell hesitated, glancing toward the window as if expecting someone to overhear. "There were rumors, of course. People talked about how jealous Thomas's younger brother, Edward, had been of him. Edward fancied himself in love with Amelia, though she barely gave him the time of day. Then there was the housekeeper, Mrs. Pritchard, who supposedly caught Amelia arguing with someone the night she vanished. But nothing was ever proven." Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Treadwell for her insights and promised to return should she need further clarification. As she walked home through the drizzle, her mind churned with possibilities. If the remains discovered in the well belonged to Amelia Maitland, then the list of potential suspects began to take shape. Thomas, driven by jealousy or despair; Edward, consumed by unrequited love; even Mrs. Pritchard, whose motives remained murky. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sight of Emily Trefusis hurrying along the path ahead of her, clutching a large leather-bound book. Spotting Miss Marple, Emily stopped abruptly, her cheeks flushing pink. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't expect to see you here," she stammered, attempting to tuck the book under her arm inconspicuously. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Good morning, my dear. Off to the library, are we?" Emily hesitated, clearly flustered. "Not exactly. This is, well, it's Great Aunt Edith's journal. I thought it might contain something useful about Willowmere. With everything that's happened, I can't help feeling there's more to the story than meets the eye." Miss Marple's interest was piqued. "How thoughtful of you to investigate. Would you mind terribly if I took a look at it? Reluctantly, Emily handed over the journal. Its cover was cracked and worn, the pages brittle with age. Miss Marple opened it carefully, scanning the neat handwriting within. Most entries detailed mundane aspects of village life, but one passage stood out. Asterisk June 15, 1942. Strange goings-on at Willowmere tonight. Heard raised voices coming from the garden near the old well. Amelia stormed inside looking pale as a ghost, while Edward followed close behind, shouting something about betrayal. Whatever transpired, I fear it will not end well. Asterisk Miss Marple closed the journal slowly, her expression unreadable. Fascinating, she murmured. It seems we're beginning to piece together a timeline. Emily bit her lip nervously. Do you think it means anything? About the body, I mean. It may, Miss Marple replied, handing the journal back. Every detail matters, however small. Thank you for sharing this, my dear. You've been most helpful. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Constable Palkins, who was poring over reports in his cramped office. He looked up as she entered, his face lighting up with relief. Miss Marple, just the person I wanted to see. We've identified the style of the locket. It dates back to the early 1900s, which aligns with the estimated time of death. Also, Dr. Haydock confirmed signs of trauma consistent with a heavy blow to the head. Whoever killed her meant business. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And what of the initials? Have you made any progress tracing them? Palkins shook his head. Not yet. But given what you've uncovered about the Maitlands, it seems likely they refer to Amelia May. Still, we'll need more evidence to confirm her identity. As Miss Marple left the station, she couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was closer than ever and yet still tantalizingly out of reach. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but the picture they formed remained obscured by layers of deception and half-truths. That evening, as she sat by the fire with her knitting, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. Human nature, she reminded herself, was both predictable and profoundly complex. People lied, loved, betrayed, and sought redemption in ways that often defied logic, but always, they left traces behind. And so, with a determined gleam in her eye, Miss Marple prepared to delve deeper into the tangled web of secrets surrounding Willowmere Manor. For in St. Mary Mead, where the past lingered like the scent of roses in bloom, no secret stayed buried forever. Chapter 4. Shadows in the Garden. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, as though nature itself had decided to offer a brief respite from the gloom that had settled over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the rhythms of village life, rose early and took her usual seat by the window with a cup of tea. Her mind buzzed with fragments of information: the initials AM, the locket, Amelia Maitland's disappearance, Edward Hargreaves' volatile temper, and the whispered arguments near the old well. Each clue was like a thread in an intricate tapestry, waiting to be woven together into a coherent picture. As she sipped her tea, her gaze wandered to the garden outside, where dew clung to the spider webs strung between rose bushes. She thought about the significance of places, the way certain locations seemed to hold memories, almost as if they bore witness to events long past. The old well at Willowmere Manor was such a place, its stones steeped in history and perhaps tragedy. It was there, she suspected, that the truth lay buried, not just beneath the earth, but within the hearts of those who had once walked among its shadows. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Clara Benson, Emily Trefus's friend and confidant. Clara looked unusually flustered, her cheeks flushed and her hands trembling slightly as she held onto her handbag. Miss Marple, she began breathlessly, I'm sorry to disturb you so early, but I didn't know what else to do. Something strange happened last night, and I think it might be important. Miss Marple gestured for her to sit down, her curiosity piqued. "Do go on, my dear. You know I'm always willing to listen." Clara hesitated, glancing nervously toward the door before leaning closer. "It's about Emily. She came to see me late last night, said she'd found something else in Great Aunt Edith's things." Another journal entry, this one dated just days after Amelia disappeared. It mentioned seeing someone sneaking around the grounds of Willowmere late at night. Aunt Edith wrote that she couldn't make out who it was, but she was sure they were carrying something heavy, a bundle, or perhaps a sack. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-click. "Did she describe the person at all?" Clara shook her head. "Not really. Just that they wore dark clothing and moved quickly, as though trying not to be seen. But here's the strangest part," she said. She heard them muttering under their breath, something about putting an end to it. And then Clara trailed off, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Then she wrote that she wished she hadn't seen anything at all, because it would only bring trouble." Miss Marple set her teacup down carefully, her expression thoughtful. "That does sound significant. Did Emily say anything else?" "She didn't want to talk much after that," Clara admitted. "She seemed frightened, actually. Said she felt like someone was watching her. I told her it was probably just nerves, but now I'm not so sure." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Fear had a way of sharpened senses. It made people notice things they might otherwise overlook. If Emily truly believed she was being watched, it could mean that someone else was aware of her discoveries and intended to keep them hidden. After Clara departed, Miss Marple resolved to visit Willowmere Manor herself. Though she rarely involved herself directly in investigations, she knew that sometimes answers could only be found by walking the same paths as those who had come before. Armed with her umbrella and a notebook, she set off toward the estate, her steps steady despite the weight of anticipation pressing upon her shoulders. When she arrived, Jonathan Hargreaves greeted her with polite surprise. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I hope you don't mind my intrusion," she replied warmly. "I simply wanted to take a closer look at the gardens. Old estates like this always fascinate me. They're full of stories, aren't they?" Jonathan smiled faintly, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Of course, feel free to wander. Just be careful, the grounds are still a bit unstable in places." Miss Marple thanked him and made her way toward the old well, which had been cordoned off with police tape. The air around it felt heavier somehow, as though the very earth carried the weight of secrets long concealed. She knelt beside it, examining the crumbling stones and the surrounding soil. Footprints marred the damp ground, some fresh, others older, but none offered immediate clarity. As she stood, her attention was drawn to a nearby copse of trees where a figure lingered in the shadows. At first glance, it appeared to be one of the workmen, but something about their posture struck her as odd. They seemed hesitant, almost furtive, as if unsure whether to approach or retreat. Deciding to investigate further, Miss Marple called out cheerfully, "Good morning. Lovely weather we're having, isn't it?" The figure startled visibly and turned away, disappearing into the thicker foliage beyond. Miss Marple watched them go, her brow furrowing slightly. Whoever they were, they clearly had no desire to be seen. Returning to the main house, she encountered Jonathan again, this time accompanied by Emily Trefusis. The young woman looked pale and distracted, clutching a small notebook tightly in her hands. "Miss Marple," Emily said softly, "I need your help. I think I've uncovered something dangerous." Miss Marple regarded her kindly, but firmly. "Tell me everything, my dear. Secrets have a way of unraveling when brought into the light." Emily hesitated, then opened the notebook to reveal a series of sketches and notes. "These are based on descriptions from Great Aunt Edith's journals. She mentioned seeing a man leaving the property late at night, carrying something bulky. I tried to reconstruct his route through the garden, and—" her voice faltered, "and I think I know where he went." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Where? To the summer house, Emily whispered. It's overgrown now, but Aunt Edith wrote that it used to be a favorite spot for the Maitlands. She said it was also where Amelia spent her final evening alive. A chill ran down Miss Marple's spine. The summer house, if it still stood, could hold vital clues, perhaps even evidence that had eluded everyone thus far. With Jonathan's reluctant permission, they ventured toward the structure, its roof sagging under the weight of years. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay, but amidst the debris, Miss Marple spotted something gleaming faintly in the corner. Kneeling, she retrieved a tarnished silver button engraved with the initials E.H. Edward Hargreaves. Well, she murmured, holding it up to the light. This certainly adds an interesting wrinkle to our mystery. Emily stared at the button, her face pale. Do you think Edward killed her? That he hid the body in the well? Miss Marple rose slowly, her expression inscrutable. We mustn't jump to conclusions, my dear. Evidence can point in many directions, and human motives are rarely straightforward. Still, she glanced back at the dilapidated summer house, her thoughts swirling like leaves caught in an autumn breeze. Still, it seems we are drawing closer to the truth. As they returned to the house, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were watching them. Somewhere in the tangled web of lies and half-truths surrounding Willowmere Manor, someone was determined to protect their secrets at any cost. Chapter 5. The Fragility of Memory. The discovery of the silver button engraved with the H cast a long shadow over St. Marymead, both literally and figuratively. As Miss Marple walked home that evening, the fading sunlight filtered through the trees in streaks of gold and crimson, painting the village in hues that seemed almost too vivid for the somber mood settling over its inhabitants. News of the find had spread quickly. Nothing remained secret for long in such a close-knit community, and whispers followed her as she passed by the post office, the bakery, and Mrs. Price Ridley's garden. Edward Hargreaves, murmured Miss Marple to herself as she entered her cottage, closing the door firmly behind her. She placed the evidence bag containing the button on the table and regarded it thoughtfully. It was a small thing, really a mere trinket, but it carried with it the weight of implication. If Edward had been involved in Amelia Maitland's disappearance, what had driven him to such an act? Jealousy, desperation, or something darker still? Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. Opening it, she found Dr. Haydock standing on her doorstep, his expression unusually grave. Miss Marple, he began without preamble, I've just received some new information from the lab regarding the remains. The skeletal analysis suggests the victim sustained multiple injuries prior to death, not just the fatal blow to the head. There are signs of defensive wounds on the arms and hands, indicating a struggle. Miss Marple's heart sank. Such details painted a grim picture indeed. A struggle. That implies intent, doesn't it? Whoever did this wasn't acting on impulse, Dr. Haydock nodded. Exactly. And there's more. They also found traces of fabric caught in the jawbone, likely remnants of a scarf or shawl. Preliminary tests suggest it matches materials commonly used during the early 1940s. Miss Marple's mind raced. A scarf could mean many things: a weapon, a disguise, or even a keepsake left behind unintentionally. But combined with the initials AM on the locket and the button bearing EH, the pieces began to form a disturbing narrative. Thank you, Doctor, she said quietly. This is most helpful. After Dr. Haydock departed, Miss Marple sat down by the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly as she processed the new developments. The presence of defensive wounds suggested that Amelia had fought back, an act of defiance against her attacker. Was it someone she knew? Someone she trusted? The idea sent a shiver down her spine. Betrayal, after all, was among the cruelest of human acts. The next morning, Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to the vicarage. Reverend Trefusis, though often oblivious to the intricacies of village gossip, occasionally proved a valuable source of insight, especially when it came to historical records kept within the church archives. Emily accompanied her father on this occasion, her face pale but resolute. Miss Marple, Reverend Trefusis greeted her warmly. "What brings you here today?" "I'm hoping to consult your parish registers," she replied, taking a seat in the cozy study. "Specifically, any entries related to the Maitland family around 1942. The vicar nodded and retrieved a dusty ledger from the shelf. Together, they pored over the faded ink and brittle pages, searching for clues. Eventually, Miss Marple's sharp eyes alighted upon an entry that made her pause. "Here," she said, pointing to a line near the bottom of the page. "Amelia May Maitland, baptized April 12, 1920. And look, there's another entry dated June 17, 1942. A funeral service held for an unknown soul. No name provided." Reverend Trefusis frowned. "How peculiar. I don't recall ever hearing about this before. Perhaps my predecessor omitted certain details to avoid scandal." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her thoughts racing. A funeral without a name, a body hastily laid to rest, perhaps to conceal its identity. Had Amelia's family known of her fate yet chosen to bury the truth along with her remains? Or had someone else orchestrated the burial to cover their tracks? Emily, who had been silent until now, spoke up hesitantly. Do you think my great-aunt Edith might have attended the service? She was very active in the church back then." "It's possible," Miss Marple mused. "And if she did, she may have written about it in her journal." With renewed determination, Emily promised to search further through her aunt's papers. Meanwhile, Miss Marple turned her attention to another potential lead, Thomas Hargreaves, Jonathan's uncle and Amelia's former fiancé. Though he had left St. Mary Mead decades ago, his connection to the case was undeniable. Perhaps it was time to seek him out. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Constable Palkins, who was busy updating his notes on the investigation. "Constable," she began, "have we managed to locate Thomas Hargreaves yet?" Palkins sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "We've traced him to a small town in Scotland, but so far, he hasn't responded to our inquiries. Given the circumstances, I doubt he'll be eager to talk." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. People rarely wish to revisit painful memories. "Still, I suspect his perspective could prove invaluable. Might I suggest sending a letter rather than a formal summons? Sometimes a gentler approach yields better results." Palkins agreed, and together they drafted a carefully worded message expressing sympathy for the difficult situation while emphasizing the importance of closure for the village. As evening fell, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, where she found Emily waiting anxiously on her doorstep. "I found something else," Emily blurted out, holding up a fragile sheet of paper. Another journal entry from the day of the funeral. Aunt Edith wrote that she saw Thomas Hargreaves leaving the churchyard shortly after the service. "He looked devastated," she said, "but there was someone else with him. Someone whose face she couldn't quite see." Miss Marple took the paper gently, her pulse quickening. "Did she mention anything else?" "Only that the second person seemed agitated, like they were arguing with Thomas. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she noticed they kept glancing toward the woods." "The woods?" Miss Marple repeated softly. Could it be that the summer house wasn't the only hiding place connected to the tragedy? The dense woodland surrounding Willowmere Manor offered countless spots where secrets could be concealed. Her mind drifted back to the figure she'd glimpsed earlier near the copse of trees, the one who had vanished into the shadows. Was it possible they, too, were searching for something, or guarding it? By the time Emily departed, Miss Marple felt a growing certainty that the answers lay not just in the past, but in the present. Human nature rarely changed. People acted out of love, fear, greed, or guilt, often repeating patterns across generations. In unraveling the mystery of Amelia Maitland's fate, she was beginning to uncover far more than a single crime. It was a tapestry of lives intertwined, each thread pulling taut under the weight of hidden truths. Chapter 6. A Letter from the North. The days that followed were marked by a peculiar tension in St. Mary Mead. The village, usually so placid and unpredictable, seemed to hold its breath as news of Thomas Hargreaves' potential involvement rippled through its inhabitants. Miss Marple, ever the observer, noted how conversations grew hushed when she approached, how eyes darted toward her with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. It was as though the entire community had become entangled in the web of Willamere's secrets, a web spun decades ago, but still sticky with consequence. Then, one crisp morning, the postman delivered a letter addressed to Constable Palkins. Written on plain stationery and bearing a Scottish postmark, it carried the unmistakable weight of revelation. By midday, Miss Marple found herself seated in the constable's modest office, where he read aloud the contents of Thomas Hargreaves' response. "Dear Constable Palkins," the letter began, "I must confess, your inquiry has reopened wounds I thought long healed. The mention of Amelia Maitland is like a ghost rising from the past, haunting me anew. Yes, I loved her deeply, and her disappearance shattered what remained of my heart. But I assured you, I had no hand in her death if indeed she is dead. I left St. Mary Mead not out of guilt, but because I could no longer bear to live among the whispers and accusations. That summer of 1942 remains etched in my memory like a scar. Amelia and I quarreled the day before she vanished over something trivial, now lost to time, but I never saw her again after that argument. When her family announced she was missing, I felt as though the ground beneath me had crumbled. As for the funeral service you mentioned, I attended only briefly. My brother Edward accompanied me, though we parted ways shortly afterward. He was distraught, inconsolable even, though whether it stemmed from grief or guilt, I cannot say. Our relationship fractured entirely after that day, and I have not spoken to him since. The letter concluded with a plea. If there is any way I can assist in uncovering the truth, please let me know. For Amelia's sake and perhaps for my own, I need closure. Miss Marple sat quietly as Constable Palkins folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. His brow furrowed as he considered the implications. "What do you make of it?" he asked finally, glancing at her. "It confirms much of what we suspected," Miss Marple replied, her voice measured. "Thomas clearly loved Amelia, yet their relationship appears to have been strained. The mention of Edward's distress is significant, don't you think? And his admission that they parted ways suggests discord, perhaps even conflict." Palkins nodded slowly. "But does it exonerate Thomas, or merely shift suspicion onto Edward?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Human nature is rarely so straightforward, Constable. Both men had motives, opportunities, and means. What we must determine is which of them acted upon them." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Emily Trefusis, who had taken to spending hours poring over her great-aunt Edith's journals. The young woman greeted her with a mixture of relief and unease, clutching another faded notebook tightly in her hands. "I've been reading more about the summer of 1942, Emily said, leading Miss Marple to a quiet corner of the vicarage garden. Aunt Edith wrote extensively about the tensions between Thomas and Edward during that time. She described several heated arguments, often centered around Amelia. Apparently, Edward accused Thomas of being blind to her flaws, whatever those might have been, and Thomas retaliated by calling Edward jealous and unstable." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-click. "Unstable. That's an interesting choice of words. Do you recall anything else?" Emily hesitated, flipping through the pages of the journal. "Here it's dated August 10, 1942. Aunt Edith writes, Edward grows more volatile by the day. He speaks of leaving St. Mary Mead, of starting anew somewhere far away. Yet there is a darkness in his eyes, a restlessness that frightens me. I fear he may do something rash. Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. Edward's volatility, combined with his unrequited love for Amelia, painted a troubling portrait. Had jealousy driven him to violence? Or was there another factor at play, something deeper, more insidious? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Looking up, she saw Jonathan Hargreaves striding toward them, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple, he began, nodding curtly. Emily, might I have a word? Emily exchanged a nervous glance with Miss Marple before stepping aside. Jonathan waited until she was out of earshot before speaking. I've been doing some digging of my own, he admitted, lowering his voice, about my Uncle Thomas and my grandfather Edward's father. Did you know he cut Edward out of the family will shortly before his death? Supposedly, it was due to some kind of scandal involving money, though the details are murky. Could that have fueled Edward's resentment not just toward Thomas, but toward the entire family? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Money has a way of sharpening emotions, doesn't it? Resentment, greed, betrayal, all potent motivators. Jonathan nodded grimly. Exactly. And if Edward felt wronged by both his father and his brother, who's to say he wouldn't lash out at someone close to Thomas? Someone like Amelia. Miss Marple regarded him carefully. There was something almost too eager in his tone, as though he wished to steer the investigation firmly in Edward's direction. Was it simply a desire for justice or something more personal? Before she could pursue the matter further, Jonathan excused himself, leaving Miss Marple and Emily alone once more. As they watched him walk away, Emily frowned. He seems awfully invested in all this, she murmured. Do you think he knows more than he's letting on? Miss Marple's lips curved into a slight smile. Perhaps. Or perhaps he simply wishes to prove himself innocent by pointing fingers elsewhere. Either way, we must tread carefully. That evening, as Miss Marple sat by the fire, she allowed herself to reflect on the tangled threads of the case. Thomas, consumed by grief and regret; Edward, volatile and resentful; Jonathan, determined to uncover or conceal the truth. Each character carried their own burdens, their own secrets. And then there was the shadowy figure near the woods, the locket, the button, the defensive wounds. Suddenly, a memory surfaced, a fragment of conversation overheard weeks earlier at Mrs. Price Ridley's tea party. An elderly neighbor, Mrs. Fothergill, had mentioned seeing someone wandering near Willowmere late one night. At the time, Miss Marple had dismissed it as idle gossip, but now it took on new significance. Rising from her chair, she resolved to pay Mrs. Fothergill a visit first thing in the morning. For in St. Mary Mead, even the smallest detail could illuminate the darkest corners of a mystery. Chapter 7. The Watcher in the Shadows. The morning air was crisp and cool as Miss Marple made her way to Mrs. Fothergill's cottage, a quaint little dwelling nestled at the edge of St. Mary Mead. The elderly woman, known for her sharp tongue and sharper eyes, greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and mild irritation. Well, if it isn't Miss Marple, Mrs. Fothergill said, adjusting her shawl as she ushered her visitor inside. To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure? Miss Marple smiled warmly, taking the proffered seat by the hearth. I'm afraid I've come to pry into your memory, my dear Mrs. Fothergill. You mentioned something at Mrs. Price Ridley's tea party about seeing someone near Willowmere late one night. Do you recall the details? Mrs. Fothergill's lips pursed thoughtfully. Ah, yes. It was some weeks ago now, though. I dare say it feels like yesterday. I couldn't sleep, so I sat by my bedroom window knitting, as one does. That's when I saw them, a figure moving stealthily along the edge of the woods near the manor. They kept to the shadows, but there was just enough moonlight to make out their silhouette. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her interest piqued. Could you tell anything about them? Their height, build, or manner of dress? The older woman frowned, her gaze drifting toward the window as though replaying the scene in her mind. They were tall, I think, or perhaps it only seemed so because they carried themselves with such purpose. And they wore dark clothing, which made them harder to spot. But she paused, her expression growing uneasy. There was something odd about the way they moved, almost furtive, as if they didn't want to be seen. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Did you notice whether they entered the property or remained outside? I believe they slipped through the gate leading to the gardens, Mrs. Fothergill replied. But I lost sight of them after that. The trees blocked my view, you see. Thank you, Mrs. Fothergill, Miss Marple said kindly, rising from her chair. You've been most helpful. As she walked home, her thoughts churned with possibilities. Whoever the figure was, they had taken great care to avoid detection, a sign, perhaps, of guilt or fear. Could it have been Jonathan Hargreaves, revisiting the site of his discovery under cover of darkness? Or someone else entirely, someone with knowledge of the estate's secrets? Her musings were interrupted by the sight of Dr. Haydock approaching from the opposite direction. His face bore an expression of urgency, and he quickened his pace upon spotting her. Miss Marple, he called out, tipping his hat. I've just received more information from the lab. Those fabric traces found on the remains. They've identified it as wool, specifically the type used in military uniforms during World War II. Miss Marple stopped in her tracks, her mind racing. Military uniforms, you say? That's intriguing. Do we know whose uniform it might have been, Dr. Haydock shook his head. Not yet, but given the time frame, it's possible it belonged to someone stationed nearby. There was a small encampment not far from here during the war, wasn't there? Yes, indeed, Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully. And soldiers often frequented the village. Some even formed attachments with local girls. Her gaze drifted momentarily to the horizon, where Willowmere Manor loomed faintly in the distance. Could Amelia Maitland have been involved with someone from the camp? If so, it would explain why her family might have wished to keep her disappearance quiet. Dr. Haydock raised an eyebrow. You think scandal played a role? It's certainly plausible, Miss Marple replied. Families will go to great lengths to protect their reputations, especially during uncertain times. A liaison with a soldier, particularly if it ended badly, could have cast a shadow over the Maitlands' standing in the community. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple decided to pay another visit to Emily Trefusis, who had continued her diligent search through Great-aunt Edith's journals. The young woman greeted her with excitement, holding up a brittle sheet of paper triumphantly. I found something, she exclaimed. Aunt Edith wrote about a soldier, a Captain Robert Grayson, who spent time in St. Mary Mead during the summer of 1942. According to her, he and Amelia became quite close. In fact, she described seeing them together several times, walking in the gardens of Willowmere. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. How fascinating. Did she mention anything about the nature of their relationship? Emily hesitated, scanning the page. She says they seemed fond of each other, though Aunt Edith also notes that Amelia appeared troubled in his presence toward the end. She speculates that something may have gone wrong between them, though she doesn't elaborate. A falling out, perhaps, Miss Marple mused. Or worse, a betrayal. Either way, it adds another layer to our mystery. Her thoughts turned to the initials AM, engraved on the locket. Could it have been a gift from Captain Grayson, rather than a keepsake belonging solely to Amelia? And if so, what had become of him after her disappearance? Determined to pursue this new lead, Miss Marple visited Constable Palkins later that evening. He listened intently as she recounted the day's discoveries, his brow furrowing deeper with each revelation. "So we're looking at 3 potential suspects now?" he asked, ticking them off on his fingers. Edward Hargreaves, driven by jealousy and resentment. Thomas Hargreaves, possibly implicated through association, and this Captain Grayson, whose connection to Amelia remains unclear. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Though let us not forget the possibility of someone closer to home, someone who stands to gain from keeping these secrets buried." Palkins nodded grimly. "Like Jonathan Hargreaves, you mean?" "Precisely," Miss Marple replied. "His eagerness to shift suspicion onto Edward troubles me. One must always consider motive, Constable, and Jonathan has much to gain from restoring Willomere's reputation." As she left the station, Miss Marple felt the weight of the case pressing upon her shoulders. Each clue brought her closer to the truth, yet the picture remained frustratingly incomplete. Like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle scattered across a table, the fragments of evidence hinted at a larger design, one that would require patience, observation, and a keen understanding of human nature to assemble. Chapter 8. The Soldier's Shadow. The morning dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that seemed to mirror the somber mood settling over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple rose early, her mind already turning over the new lead provided by Emily Trefusis, Captain Robert Grayson, the soldier who had formed a connection with Amelia Maitland during the summer of 1942. His presence in the narrative added yet another layer of complexity, a stranger entangled in the lives of those long gone, whose actions might have cast ripples far beyond his brief stay in the village. After breakfast, Miss Marple decided to visit Dr. Haydock once more. If anyone could shed light on soldiers stationed near St. Mary Mead during the war, it would be him. He had served as a medic at the time and often spoke of the encampment not far from the village. "Ah, Miss Marple," he greeted her warmly when she arrived at his surgery. "I was wondering when you'd come calling again. What is it this time?" "I'm hoping you can tell me more about the military camp near St. Mary Mead during the war," she began, taking a seat across from him. "Specifically, I'm interested in any records or memories you might have of a Captain Robert Grayson." Dr. Haydock's expression grew thoughtful. "Grayson? Yes, I recall the name. He was well liked among the men, charismatic, charming even. But there were rumors, too. Some said he had a temper, especially when drinking. Others whispered about his involvement with local women, though nothing was ever proven." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And what became of him after the war? Do you know where he went?" The doctor hesitated, rifling through a drawer until he produced a worn ledger. "We kept rudimentary records of those stationed here, mostly for medical purposes. Let me see." He flipped through the pages, his finger tracing lines of faded ink. "Here we are. Captain Robert Grayson. Transferred to another unit in late 1940 and reported missing in action shortly thereafter. Presumed dead." "Missing in action," Miss Marple repeated softly. "How intriguing. And how convenient if one wished to disappear entirely." Dr. Haydock looked up sharply. "You think he might have faked his death?" "It's possible," she replied, her voice measured. "People do strange things under pressure, especially if they're trying to escape consequences or start anew." As she left the surgery, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the fabric traces found on Amelia's remains. If they belonged to Captain Grayson's uniform, it suggested a violent altercation between them. Had their relationship soured, or had someone else intervened, driven by jealousy or revenge? Her next stop was Mrs. Price Ridley's house, where she knew several elderly residents gathered regularly to exchange gossip and reminisce about the past. Among them was Mrs. Fenton, a former seamstress who had worked closely with the wives of soldiers during the war. Perhaps she could provide insight into Captain Grayson's character or his attire. "Captain Grayson," Mrs. Fenton repeated, her knitting needles pausing mid-click. "Oh yes, I remember him. Always impeccably dressed, even in his uniform. But there was something restless about him. He'd visit the village shops, charm the ladies, then vanish for days on end. No one really knew where he went. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Did he ever speak of personal matters? Of family, perhaps, or romantic attachments, Mrs. Fenton shook her head. Not to me, no. But I recall hearing whispers about him and Amelia Maitland. Folks said they were too close, some thought. The Maitlands weren't pleased, of course. Soldiers came and went, but their daughter was expected to marry well. Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. A clandestine romance, disapproval from Amelia's family, and a volatile partner, all ingredients for tragedy. Yet something still eluded her, some piece of the puzzle that refused to fall into place. That evening, she paid a final visit to Constable Palkins, who was poring over maps of the Willowmere estate. At her arrival, he straightened and gestured for her to sit. "I've been thinking about the timeline," he began. "If Captain Grayson disappeared in late 1942, and Amelia vanished earlier that summer, doesn't that suggest he couldn't have killed her? Unless..." His voice trailed off uncertainly. "Unless his disappearance was staged," Miss Marple finished for him. "Or unless someone else took advantage of the chaos surrounding his transfer to cover their tracks." Palkins frowned. "But why involve him at all? Why leave traces of his uniform near the body?" "To mislead us," she replied simply. "Whoever buried Amelia wanted to create confusion to point suspicion elsewhere while hiding their own guilt." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. As they sat in silence, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where raindrops streaked the glass like tears. She thought of Edward Hargreaves' volatility, Thomas' grief, Jonathan's determination, and now, Captain Grayson's shadowy presence. Each figure carried their own secrets, their own burdens. But which of them had crossed the line from passion to violence? Before leaving, Miss Marple asked one final question. "Have we traced any living relatives of Captain Grayson? Someone who might confirm or deny his fate?" Palkins sighed. "We've sent inquiries, but so far, nothing. It's as though he vanished without a trace." Miss Marple nodded and surprised. "Let us hope answers come soon. For every mystery, no matter how tangled, eventually unravels." As she walked home beneath the steady patter of rain, Miss Marple felt the weight of the case pressing upon her shoulders. The threads were drawing closer together, weaving a tapestry of secrets and lies. Yet the central truth remained obscured, hidden behind layers of deception and half-truths. Chapter 9: The Cracks in the Facade. The morning after Miss Marple's visit to Constable Palkins, a letter arrived at the vicarage addressed to Emily Trefusis. It was postmarked from a small town in Scotland, the same town where Thomas Hargreaves had been living. Emily opened it with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the contents quickly before rushing to share it with Miss Marple. "Miss Marple," she began breathlessly as they sat together in the vicarage garden, "it's from Thomas Hargreaves. He says he's coming to St. Marry me to see the place again and to face whatever truths remain." Miss Marple set aside her knitting needles, her expression thoughtful. "How intriguing, and how brave of him, I must say. Confronting the past is never easy, especially when it carries such painful memories." Emily nodded, her voice tinged with unease. "Do you think he knows something he hasn't told us yet?" "It's possible," Miss Marple replied. "People often carry secrets until the weight becomes too much to bear. Perhaps his decision to return signals a readiness to unburden himself or to protect someone else." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Jonathan Hargreaves at Willowmere Manor. She found him pacing restlessly in the library, his movements sharp and agitated. When she entered, he turned abruptly, his face pale beneath the dim light filtering through the rain-streaked windows. "Miss Marple," he greeted her curtly. "What brings you here?" I thought it best to keep you informed, she said kindly, taking a seat near the fireplace. Thomas Hargreaves will be arriving in St. Marymead soon. I imagine this news may come as unsettling. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Unsettling. That's one way to put it. My uncle has spent decades running from his problems, leaving others to clean up the mess. Now he decides to waltz back into town like some tragic hero. Forgive me if I'm not eager to welcome him with open arms. Miss Marple studied him carefully, noting the edge of bitterness in his tone. You feel he abandoned your family and perhaps even contributed to its downfall. He did, Jonathan snapped, then softened slightly, exhaling deeply. Look, I don't mean to sound harsh, but my father Edward was never the same after that summer. Neither was our family name. If Thomas knows something about what happened to Amelia, he owes it to all of us to speak up. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind racing. Jonathan's anger seemed genuine, but there was an undertone of desperation beneath his words, a need to assign blame, to find closure. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding something back, some detail he feared might surface with Thomas's arrival. As she left Willowmere, Miss Marple decided to pay another visit to Mrs. Fothergill, whose keen observations had proven invaluable. The elderly woman welcomed her with a mixture of curiosity and mild irritation, as usual. Well, Mrs. Fothergill asked pointedly, settling into her armchair, have you solved this mystery yet, or are you still poking around for scraps? Miss Marple chuckled softly. Neither, I'm afraid, though I do hope you might help me fill in a few gaps. You mentioned seeing someone near Willowmere late one night. Did you happen to notice any vehicles parked nearby or anything unusual along the road? Mrs. Fothergill frowned, her gaze drifting toward the window. Now that you mention it, there was a car, a black sedan, I think. It was parked farther down the lane, near the old oak tree. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, it does seem odd. Who drives out to Willowmere in the dead of night unless they're up to no good? A black sedan, Miss Marple murmured, committing the detail to memory. Such a vehicle would have been conspicuous in 1942, particularly in a small village like St. Marymead. Could it have belonged to Captain Grayson or someone else entirely? Her thoughts turned to Edward Hargreaves, whose volatile nature and resentment toward both his brother and his father had cast suspicion upon him. Had he driven to Willowmere that night, perhaps intending to confront Amelia or someone else entirely? Or had Captain Grayson returned under cover of darkness, seeking answers or revenge? That evening, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at Mrs. Price Ridley's house, where gossip flowed freely alongside cups of tea. Among the attendees was Mr. Carter, the village historian, who prided himself on his extensive knowledge of local law. Did you know, he remarked casually, leaning forward conspiratorially, that there used to be a caretaker's cottage on the Willowmere grounds? It burned down years ago, but folks say it was haunted. Some claimed they saw lights flickering inside long after it was abandoned. Miss Marple's ears perked up. Haunted, you say? Or perhaps merely occupied by someone wishing to avoid detection? Mr. Carter shrugged. Could be either, I suppose. But the fire itself was suspicious. Started in the middle of the night, just weeks after Amelia disappeared. No one was ever charged, though rumors flew thick and fast. By the time Miss Marple returned home, her mind was alight with possibilities. The caretaker's cottage, if indeed it had housed someone during those fateful weeks, could hold vital clues. And the fire, deliberately set or otherwise, might have been intended to destroy evidence. As she sat by the fire, knitting needles clicking softly, Miss Marple allowed herself to reflect on the tangled web of motives and opportunities surrounding the case. Thomas, burdened by guilt; Edward, consumed by jealousy and resentment; Jonathan, driven by a desire to restore his family's legacy; Captain Grayson, whose charm masked a volatile temporal were threads in a tapestry woven with lies and half-truths. And yet, amidst the chaos, one truth stood clear. The person who had buried Amelia Maitland in the old well had done so not out of haste, but calculation. Every action, the placement of the locket, the traces of fabric, the defensive wounds had been designed to mislead, to obscure the truth behind layers of deception. Miss Marple rose from her chair, her resolve firm. Tomorrow, she would visit the site of the caretaker's cottage, searching for remnants of the past that might illuminate the present. For in St. Mary Mead, where shadows lingered and whispers endured, the answers lay not in grand gestures, but in quiet observation and in the courage to confront the cracks in the facade. Chapter 10. The Truth Unearthed. The morning dawned clear and cold, with a sharpness in the air that seemed to mirror the clarity Miss Marple felt within herself. Today, she resolved, would be the day when the tangled threads of the Willowmere mystery finally came together. Armed with her knitting bag and an unshakable determination, she set out for the grounds of Willowmere Manor, not to revisit the old well, but to explore the site of the caretaker's cottage. The ruins were easy enough to find, their charred remains hidden beneath a tangle of ivy and brambles. As Miss Marple picked her way through the overgrown vegetation, she couldn't help but marvel at how nature had reclaimed what violence had destroyed. Yet even here, amidst the decay, traces of human activity lingered, fragments of pottery, rusted hinges and shards of glass glinting faintly in the sunlight. She knelt beside a patch of scorched earth, brushing away layers of dirt and ash until her fingers brushed against something solid. Carefully, she unearthed a small metal box, its surface blackened by fire, but otherwise intact. Inside, she found a collection of items, a tarnished cigarette lighter engraved with the initials RG, a folded letter brittle with age, and a photograph of a young woman whose face bore an uncanny resemblance to Amelia Maitland. Miss Marple unfolded the letter with great care, her eyes scanning the faded ink. It was addressed to Captain Robert Grayson and signed simply as A. The tone was desperate, almost pleading, *Robert, please believe me, I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought we could be happy together, far from St. Mary Mead and its judgments. But now everything has gone wrong, and I fear there is no way back. If you still care for me, meet me at the summer house tonight. We must decide what to do before it's too late. Her heart sank as she read the words. This was no simple romance gone awry. It was a story of betrayal, desperation, and fear. Amelia had sought solace in Captain Grayson, only to find herself ensnared in a web of lies and danger. And someone, perhaps Grayson himself, perhaps another, had silenced her forever. As Miss Marple stood, her gaze drifted toward the woods where she had glimpsed the shadowy figure weeks earlier. She now understood why they had lingered, watching their presence tied not to guilt, but to grief or regret. Perhaps it was Thomas Hargreaves, drawn to the place where his love had met her tragic end. Or perhaps it was someone else entirely, seeking closure in their own way. Her musings were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Turning, she saw Jonathan Hargreaves striding toward her, his expression unreadable. "I thought I might find you here," he said, stopping a few paces away. "What have you discovered?" Miss Marple held up the metal box. Pieces of the past, fragments that tell a story far more complicated than any of us imagined. Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly. "And does that story implicate my family further? Or are you finally ready to point the finger elsewhere?" Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "The truth implicates many people, Mr. Hargreaves, not just your family. But if you're asking whether Edward killed Amelia, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that jealousy and resentment drove him to act rashly. He confronted Amelia near the summer house on the night she disappeared, accusing her of betraying him with Captain Grayson. There was a struggle, and she fell, striking her head fatally against the stone bench. Panicked, Edward hid her body in the well, intending to cover his tracks. Jonathan's face paled visibly. And Grayson? Was he involved? In a manner of speaking, Miss Marple replied gently. He arrived shortly afterward, having received Amelia's letter. Finding her gone and evidence of foul play, he fled not out of cowardice, but because he feared being implicated. The fire at the caretaker's cottage was likely his doing, an attempt to destroy anything that might connect him to her. Jonathan sank onto a nearby rock, his shoulders slumping under the weight of revelation. So my grandfather disinherited Edward not because of financial scandal, but because he suspected the truth about Amelia. And Thomas. Thomas left because he couldn't bear to live with the knowledge. Precisely, Miss Marple said. Your family has carried this burden for decades, each generation shaped by secrets they could neither confront nor escape. But now, perhaps, it is time to lay those ghosts to rest. Later that afternoon, as news of the discovery spread through St. Mary Mead, Thomas Hargreaves arrived at the vicarage, his face lined with exhaustion and sorrow. He embraced Emily briefly before turning to Miss Marple. I owe you an apology and gratitude, he said quietly. For years, I've carried the guilt of leaving, believing I could outrun the pain. But now I see that running solves nothing. Whatever happens next, I am ready to face it. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Courage, Mr. Hargreaves, is often the hardest path but also the most rewarding. That evening, as twilight settled over the village, Miss Marple sat by her fire once more, her knitting needles clicking softly in the quiet room. The mystery of Willowmere Manor had been solved, its secrets brought into the light. Yet she knew that life in St. Mary Mead would continue much as it always had, filled with whispers, memories, and the enduring resilience of human nature. For in the end, every mystery carried within it a lesson that the past, however painful, must be faced before the future can unfold. And so, as the flames danced in the hearth and the shadows lengthened across the walls, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Justice, though delayed, had finally found its way to light. Thank you for listening to The Mystery of the Old Well. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel for more intriguing tales and mysteries.